Hi, my name is Mike Evans, and today I'm going to be speaking about Jonathan Edwards and spiritual revival. Jonathan Edwards is probably best known for preaching what many consider the most famous sermon in American history, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. He preached this sermon during the height of the First Great Awakening, a revival movement that spanned not only all of colonial America, but had a transatlantic impact as well. However, this was not Edwards' first encounter with revivals. Nearly a decade earlier, Edwards was at the epicenter of a revival in Hampshire County that many believe had a tremendous influence on the much more famous revival of the mid-18th century. In fact, the first book Edwards ever published was a detailed account of this earlier revival. It also had one of the longest titles of any of his books, a faithful narrative of the surprising work of God in the conversion of many hundred souls in Northampton and the neighboring towns and villages of Hampshire in New England. Now that's a mouthful. In this book, Edwards records with precise detail many conversion accounts and general revival observations that took place from 1734 to 1735 in Northampton and the surrounding towns. I'm standing in front of a picture of the church building that now stands where the third meeting house was built in 1737, shortly after the Northampton Revival. This building was constructed in 1877 and has seen continuous use ever since. According to Stephen Nichols, in his short biography on Edwards, the 1734 revival was kick-started by two key factors. First was the sudden news of the tragic death of two young individuals in nearby towns. Second was the, quote, most unexpected work of God in converting a particular person in Edwards' own town of Northampton, end quote. Edwards never names this person, but simply states she was a, quote, company keeper, end quote. Nichols believes this meant she was likely a prostitute. Edwards was very skeptical of her testimony at first, but came to believe it was genuine. Then he worried how the congregation would treat her, but to his amazement they received her gladly. According to Nichols, quote, the display of grace in this anonymous woman's life sparked the revival, end quote. According to George Marsden, in our primary text, by the spring of 1735, the, quote, spiritual rains had turned the stream to a flood, end quote. He points out that while the Connecticut River Valley had seen its fair share of religious revivals, nothing on this scale had ever been witnessed before. Edwards believed that nearly every person who lived in Northampton was either converted or very close to being so by mid-1735. Unfortunately, the Northampton revival would be short-lived, in part due to the horrific suicide of Edwards' uncle, Joseph Hawley, on the 1st of June, 1735. It is believed many of Hawley's family placed the blame, at least partially, for his death at the feet of Edwards, because of Edwards' explicit preaching on the depravity of human beings. Patricia Tracy, in her book titled Jonathan Edwards, Pastor, states that Edwards did his best to explain why Hawley had killed himself by pointing out he was of such an extreme mental condition as to be, quote, beyond ministerial control, end quote. Tracy believes Edwards needed to, quote, vindicate himself of suspicions, even his own, of inadvertently aiding the devil to drive out the Holy Spirit, end quote. She points out that Edwards made a deliberate change in the narrative account by placing the amazing conversion accounts of both Abigail Hutchison and Phoebe Bartlett before Hawley's suicide, even though they actually occurred after his death, thus implying that their conversions took place during the high mark of the revival, and Hawley's death may mark the beginning of the end, when Satan had begun to disrupt both his and God's efforts.